Before we even start going into looking at actually analysing blessing, we need to know what it's about. And when I say what it's about, I don't mean the sort of basic content of what occurs in the poem, because that's really obvious. It's water pipe bursts, and some people try to collect that water, play in that water, and so on. Essentially, the key themes of this poem are, number one, the importance of water, and number two, poverty and that experience of having to go without something that is so important. Bigger than that, this poem is about, yes, our vulnerability as human beings, but also our ability to find joy in the face of struggle and hardship. So I want you to have, first of all of those themes in mind, because as we start going through analysing the poem, we're going to keep talking about how the crafting of the poem explores those ideas. It's always important to analyse the title of poems, because of course they are a poet's first way of introducing what their poem is about, and so they're often really essential in understanding perhaps like a key theme or a key point. In this case, the fact that it's called blessing, of course it has religious connotations of like asking God for, you know, support or help, right? So it's got those religious connotations, and that's going to be really important for us to remember. The other thing, of course, is that blessing can be something more generally that you're grateful for. So when we keep in mind both of those sets of connotations, while we don't know what the religious connotations apply to at this point, because we haven't actually read the poem, we do know that it's about being incredibly grateful for something. So when you then read the poem and you see that it's about water and this community having access to water, all of a sudden we see that theme of the importance of water. Because when you think about it, they are clearly grateful for water, and also with those religious connotations, that is actually part of a semantic field of religion. So yes, you've got the title of blessing, but you've also got, in the second stanza, water's going to be referred to as the voice of a kindly God. And further down, we're going to have a metaphor of from the huts, a congregation. Now, I'll talk about these lines in more detail as we reach them further on in the poem, but the key thing to take away about this semantic field of religion is the fact that it highlights how important water is to them, in the sense that it is seen as something that, not literally, because these are being used metaphorically, but it's something that is like worshipped. Now, although the title of the poem contains those connotations, the opening stanza actually doesn't jump to that yet. Instead, if you think about the fact that these are the opening lines of the poem, we can talk about their privileged position. That's just the name for the very first line in a poem, or first like sort of couple of lines, and the key ideas that are explored in those. And what's established in our privileged position is actually the lack of water, okay? There never is enough water. Now, of course, that line of the poem is pretty explicit, so we don't want to analyze that from a language perspective. We can analyze it from a structural perspective though. And what we're able to say from a structural perspective is the fact that the poem begins by foregrounding the impact of no water. And there's a few lines where it does that. So the opening line is really important to that. The skin cracks like a pod. So you could think of that imagery of cracks as being really painful and uncomfortable. And when we think of the pod being like natural imagery, it fits with this idea of something like being quite barren and lacking. Like they're really missing something by the lack of water. So on the one hand, this simile is supposed to be emphasizing how dry their skin is because they don't have any water and the lack of moisture and the dehydration. But it also serves to create a sort of atmosphere of discomfort and uncomfortableness and emptiness as well. That continuation of discomfort and emptiness can be seen in the next stanza too, where we're told to imagine the drip of it, the small splash echo in a tin mug. So here it's again talking about the tiny amount of water by getting you to think about the small amount. Now, that use of direct address there in imagine, in fact, I go so far as to say it's more than direct address. It's like an imperative. The poet is telling our reader to do something. That raises the very important question of this poem of who is it speaking to? Who is being told to imagine? And I think essentially what this poem is about is helping us understand the experience of those without, right? It's trying to make those with appreciate what those without go through. And if you think about how, for those of us who have easy and ready access to water, how we can take it for granted, this poem is essentially about bringing a sort of new perspective to those who take it for granted and making us realize actually how precious, how valuable, how important water is, by showing us a community who don't have any water and how precious they find it. So this stanza really is about, first of all, commanding the reader to visualize how little water there is. So you've of course got drip and small splash connoting that really small sound and scale, and that is of course juxtaposed against the large sound of emptiness, because of course that's what the echo is, right? There's nothing else, so it's able to echo. So it's about stressing how little they have via that metaphor of an echo in a tin mug. Now it's really important to keep in mind that in terms of our crafting, we've got a lot of sensory language going on here, because of course the skin cracks like a pod. That's your senses of what you can see, but also what you can feel, your touch as well. While this one, the drip and the echo in a tin mug, are all about the sound as well as the visuals. So our poet is really trying to create a full immersive vision for us of what it looks like to be without water. And again, as I said before, the importance of that structurally is about foregrounding. So that's, remember, foregrounding is when a writer makes something sort of stand out, and their writer here is really trying to foreground what it's like to not have access to water, as a means of giving us who take water for granted that new perspective. You then have it being referred to as the voice of a kindly God. Now this is an interesting image in that it seems to have positive connotations, kindly God. So God having connotations of like benevolence, kindly obviously having connotations there of support. So the laudatory connotations of that metaphor of the voice of a kindly God seem to juxtapose against the imagery of things being uncomfortable and lacking and empty in echo in a tin mug and the skin cracks like a pod. And what that actually does is just further highlight how much they value this water. Even though they've only got a tiny amount, that tiny amount that they do have, they greatly appreciate. They still remember that God, that connotations of like worship. They are so incredibly grateful for what they can get. Then when we come to our next stanza, this is where we have everything change. So you have this line, sometimes the sudden rush of fortune. So we have a volta here in the poem. Now a volta is when there is a sudden change in emotion or tone. And essentially that change in emotion and tone is directly tied into the fact that what changes in the content of the poem is we're going to go from there never being enough water to suddenly having some water. Now what's also interesting about when we have this volta is how the language changes too. So if you think about what we had before, we had first of all this use of the word adverb never back up in the second line of the poem, right? And that's a very sort of strong adverb there that really reinforces how sort of constant the struggle and suffering is for these people. However, at the start of this one, we've got sometimes. So there's a little bit of a shift here in terms of like there's more of a sense of there being rarity. So it's still a struggle, but they sometimes have good luck, fortune. The other change that we see is in the energy of the language. So you can see that in the first two stanzas, we have lots of monosyllabic words. The skin cracks like a pod. Drip, small, splash, echo, tin, mug, etc. There are obviously a couple exceptions to that, but by and large is mainly monosyllabic. And then all of a sudden here, the words, yes, become typically more than one syllable, but I would say the more important point is the energy behind the words becomes a lot stronger. So yes, you have words like sudden and the connotations there of immediacy of something, but you also have these dynamic verbs, rush, burst, crash, And then you also have the noun flow. You have this semantic field, if we include sudden in that as well, you have this semantic field of energy and movement, which is really different from that sort of tiny, just like small splash, monosyllabic lack of anything that we had in the first two stanzas. So when we have that contrast, what we can see is how the immediacy of how water can change things for people. I think it's worth noting that I think there's a little bit of a political message within this, in the fact that we're told the municipal pipe bursts. Municipal, it just means like local government. So the way that the poet is focusing on describing the pipe with that adjective municipal, they're really trying to foreground the political ownership, the power involved in access to water. Because of course we've been told these people are lacking water, and yet the pipe bursts and there's loads of it. So it seems to be a comment on power and how those in power are perhaps restricting others with their access to water. So there is a comment on poverty and the unequal opportunity and access to precious resources that those who are poor have, and also a comment on perhaps human fragility, our interdependence on one another, and that sense of community that can be lacking from those in power because they do not help everybody equally, which is of course going to contrast in a second with the sense of community amongst these people who are now accessing the water. I think it's interesting that the writer referred to it as fortune as well, this sudden rush of fortune. Like I said before, that essentially just means like your luck, your good luck. So there isn't any actual control or power that these people have here in order to get at the water. It's just a sense of chance. So it in a way highlights their powerlessness. If you think about that combined with the municipal pipe bursting, it's almost as if their good fortune has come at the expense of those in power because, their pipe has burst. And so it's perhaps a comment on how we lack any control over our lives and those in power are the ones with all the control. Nevertheless, though, that is such a sort of tiny focus of the poem, because what it really wants to give its energy to is how the people react to the water, and that is just with unbridled joy. We can see the sort of joy and appreciation they have for this water, first of all in the semantic field of value. Okay, so it's going to be fortune again, because of course another definition of the word fortune, as well as being your good luck, is also a vast amount of wealth. And that fits with the description of the water being silver. That metaphor of silver crashes to the ground. So that connotation of high value there is really clearly suggesting that water is incredibly important to these people. You also have, as we've already mentioned, that religious imagery with the metaphor, a congregation. So there are a few things that we could say about the congregation. First of all, it's the sense of community that it creates, because if you think about a congregation, it's about people coming together, to worship. So it's about people coming together to be as one, to celebrate and enjoy life, to support one another, all the various things that you would do within the church. And what's interesting as well is how the writer has this line, every man, woman, child for streets around butts in. Because of course, normally if you've got a list like that, you would need to put commas between each thing. But actually what the lack of punctuation is doing here, first of all, I think it's part of creating that high energy that I was talking about before, along with rush, burst, crash, flow. It's this idea of everybody's moving so quickly there isn't even time to punctuate. And also that sense of community in that it's just everybody all in together. You can't really separate them. And so the lack of punctuation is important in conveying both that energy and that community as they're trying to get at this water. You then have it followed by this asyndetic list of what they're trying to collect the water with. So pots, brass, copper, aluminium, plastic buckets, frantic hands. Now this asyndetic list, asyndetic means that each item in the list is joined with a comma rather than the word and. The and is of course going to come down here with the naked children. But the asyndetic list is also really important in creating that really fast pace and energy as we read it. It's also worth noting the actual items in the list as well, because essentially what happens as we go down the list is there's an increasing sense of desperation in there, okay? Because it starts off with items you would expect somebody to collect water with. A pot, something made of brass, something made of copper, something made of aluminium. So notice the sort of degradation in the preciousness of those metals, brass to copper to aluminium to plastic, a degradation in the materials, not just in the metals. And then of course just to your straight hands. So it's this idea of in any way that they can, they are trying to get at the water, and it really conveys that desperation. It's worth being aware of the actual definition of the word frantic too. So the word frantic means that things are done quickly and in an energetic but disorganized way because there is very little time. So that is really important in conveying how the people are feeling. And I think it's very deliberate to focus in on the hands and the objects, because rather than sort of describing them sort of as like frantic people, it's frantic hands, because it's all about focusing on the action that they are doing, the energy that they have and are engaging in. So we understand from the use of that word frantic, as well as all the other crafting going on that creates that real energy and fast pace, we understand that for these people, this is a precious, rare moment that they have to take full advantage of. And they're really eager to take advantage of as well. Like if you look at that line, a roar of tongues. So what you've got here is a technique called synesthesia. Now, synesthesia is an actual medical condition where basically people's senses are mixed up. So they can taste smells, or they can hear colors or something like that. But it can also be used as a literary device where essentially you mix up the adjectives or the nouns of one sense with the adjectives or nouns with another sense. In this case, roar is of course a sound, but it's being applied to something that is about touch and taste of the tongue. So we have to ask ourselves why that is. So if we think first of all about the connotations of roar, okay, yes, it makes us perhaps think of a lion, so perhaps power. And I think there is perhaps room to argue linked to that idea of community, that it is about the power of everybody coming together, but I think that's a lesser point. I think the more important thing that this is about the force, the energy, the desperation with which people want this water, as we've seen from all the other techniques going on in this stanza. And the fact that all the people are referred to via their tongues, just as with before they were referred to with their hands. This idea of like not talking about people, but just focusing in on a particular body part, that is a technique called synecdoche. Now, synecdoche is when you make a small part represent the whole. In this case, the part of people's bodies, their tongues, is being used to represent their entire being. And I think the reason the poet's done that, the reason the poet has placed all the emphasis on tongues is, yes, of course, it indicates the action that the people are taking, right? They're going like this to try and get at some water. I think this is really important in conveying, again, the excitement and eagerness to just get immediately at the water. They want at this water as quickly and immediately as they can, so they're just straight immediately opening their mouth and going straight to the tongue. So I think the tongue feels more intimate, personal, quick, and fits with this idea of the sort of frenzied atmosphere now that this water pipe has burst. And I think frenzied is a key word I would use to describe this entire stanza, that it's about showing the frenzied excitement to get at the water. When we then go to the next stanza, this is really where the unbridled joy that I mentioned before is really reinforced. And I think the reason it's done via children in particular is because of children conveying just like, children are that perfect balance between the positive imagery of joy and hope and, you know, the future and innocence and all those wonderful things, but also weakness and vulnerability as well. And I think they perfectly sort of encapsulate the struggle in the human condition, because of course the fact that these children are naked, I think, is on one hand a sort of comment on their poverty, right? They don't have, you know, any clothes, they don't have anything. But on the other hand, is just a feeling of they're not holding, it could be like a metaphor for the fact that they don't hold anything back. They just are very open with who they are. They represent that natural, instinctive way for humans to be. So when we see how they behave, we get filled with that feeling of joy as well. I'm thinking about how much hope there is for human beings, that even in times of extreme poverty and hardship, children can still find things to be joyful about. So we have them screaming in the liquid sun. Now, that metaphor of the liquid sun, what it's basically trying to refer to is this idea that like there is so much water around that the sun is being reflected in all of this water. So it feels like it's almost liquid itself. It's, you know, the water is everywhere, and so the sun has become covered in that too. So in many ways, it's a huge contrast to what we saw in stanza 1 with there never is enough water. Suddenly it's a feeling of there being an almost overwhelming amount of water. The choice of the dynamic verb screaming is of course just part of continuing that energy, excitement as the frenzied atmosphere of earlier in the poem too. Now the highlights in the line polished to perfection, that's referring to essentially the bone structure of the children, right? So it's like, you know, their cheekbones, their collarbone, elbows, knees, whatever. It being described as polished to perfection, there are two elements to this, and I think we see this throughout this stanza, is a sort of bittersweet tone to it. Because on the one hand, the imagery of being polished to perfection is like a metaphor for the beauty of this sight and the children. That idea of them looking, if you think of something being polished, it has connotations of being like cared for and being made to look better. I mean, perfection, the extremeness of that particular word and how it makes the people look. That being said, with highlights referencing their bone structure, that's also essentially reminding us of their poverty at the same time. And so on the one hand, it's kind of saying like, with that capacity that humans have for hope, in this joyful moment of gaining access to water, everything suddenly seems so much better. These children seem like they are being cared for and they're incredibly happy. But it never lets us forget about the poverty, because don't forget, we were told back up in this stanza, sometimes the sudden rush of fortune. So it's sort of like, you know, they are still suffering, they are still in hardship, even if they're getting this just brief moment of joy. We could also say that we've got more of the religious imagery in this stanza with the flashing light. So the flashing light, the reason I say religious imagery is because I think it's almost like God is here, you know? God is there celebrating with them, and we're told the blessing sings over their small bones. And of course, we've already talked about those connotations of blessing there. It can be, in when I'm saying all this religious imagery, it can be literal. It can be that these people do have religious faith and this is a sort of moment from God, but it could also just be metaphorical in the sense that water is like a godly experience. Accessing water for these people is like having a divine experience, because suddenly, you know, you've wanted something so much and it is here and it brings you so much joy and you're so grateful for it and you're praising it, just as somebody perhaps would with God and having a prayer for God and putting forward a blessing for God. And that fits with this line of the blessing sings over their small bones. So you could even say that sings has religious connotations in the sense of like songs of praise and why people sing in church, and that sense of joy and happiness that it comes from singing. But also, if we think about what is doing the singing, it's the blessing. So water is again being referred to as a blessing. So I think the reason that she says the blessing is actually a reference back to the title again, just so we can really heavily connect those dots that what is the blessing for these people is the water. And so we've got this metaphor of the water being outright referred to as a blessing, and it shows how grateful they are for it and how important it is for them. But also by therefore personifying the water as singing over their bones, it's like, first of all, a kind of sense of protection. It's singing over their small bones. It's that almost like feelings of joy and happiness protecting them from the hardship that they're having to go through. But we're still not allowed to forget about that hardship because it's their small bones. And that is, again, thinking about the privileged position, that is the final line of the poem. The final line of the poem is their small bones. So the focus at the very end is on their poverty. So that's why I say there's a sort of bittersweet tone to this stanza, because on the one hand, it feels like a glorious moment of unity between a personified water that is happy for them and supporting them and caring for them, and the people who are so incredibly happy and grateful for the care that water is giving them. But we're never allowed to forget the fact that this is all a temporary moment, and that actually these people have been through great hardship and will probably continue to go through great hardship. Considering the poem as a whole then, when we think about Imtiaz Dharker's messages for us as a reader, I think there's two elements to it. There's the message about this community in the poem itself, but then also the sort of takeaways for those of us reading it that she was speaking to earlier with the, like, imagine the drip of it. We're supposed to be seeing the importance that water has to many communities who don't access it. And also, I think it's a comment on those communities and how even in their hardship and their suffering, they can still have joy and excitement and a hope for the future as represented in those children. But also from that, there is a comment for us as the reader to be like, appreciate water, appreciate what you have, and don't take it for granted. And so in some ways, this poem is about raising awareness. And I think that fits with Imtiaz Dharker, to be honest. A lot of her poetry is about getting us to look at different perspectives, new perspectives on issues that we may view in a particular way in the West. This is very in keeping with a lot of her poetry. And the question I would put to you, and would love to hear your thoughts about in the comment, is what sort of feeling are we as the reader supposed to be having at the end of it? Is it actually a joyful, happy poem about the perseverance of human beings and our human strength? Or are we as the reader supposed to actually be feeling quite sad about the knowledge that something so basic as water can be so precious to these people and that they are denied access to it, and the rarity and brevity of their opportunity to experience the kind of joy that they do in this poem? Let me know what you think, and also make sure to have a look at the other videos on whatever other poems it is you need to study.